Chapter 4 The Third Son, Alyosha. He was then only 20 years old. His brother Ivan was in his 24th year, and their elder brother Dmitri was going on 28. First of all, I announced that this young man, Alyosha, was not at all fanatic, and in my view at least, even not at all a mystic. I will give my full opinion beforehand. He was simply an early lover of mankind, and if he threw himself into the monastery path, it was only because it alone struck him at the time and presented him, so to speak, with an ideal way out for his soul struggling from the darkness of worldly wickedness towards the light of love. And this path struck him only because on it at that time he met a remarkable being, in his opinion our famous monastery elder Josima, to whom he became attached with all the ardent first love of his unquenchable heart. However, I do not deny that he was at that time already very strange, having been so even from the cradle. Incidentally, I have already mentioned that although he lost his mother in his 4th year, he remembered her afterwards all his life, her face, her cares, as if she were standing alive before him. Such memories can be remembered. Everyone knows this, even from an earlier age, even from the age of 2, but they only emerge throughout one's life as specks of light, as it were against the darkness, as a corner torn from huge picture, which has all faded and disappeared except for that little corner. That is exactly how it was with him. He remembered a quiet summer evening, an open window, the slanting rays of the setting sun. These slanting rays he remembered most of all. An icon in the corner of the room, a lighted oil lamp in front of it, and before the icon, on her knees, his mother, sobbing as if in hysterics, with shrieks and cries, seizing him in her arms, hugging him so tightly that it hurt, and pleading for him to the Mother of God, holding him out from her embrace with both arms towards the icon, as if under the protection of the Mother of God. And suddenly a nurse rushes in and snatches him from her in fear. What a picture! Alyosha remembered his mother's face, too, at the moment. He used to say that it was frenzied but beautiful, as far as he could remember. But he rarely cared to confide this memory to anyone. In his childhood and youth, he was not very effusive, not even very talkative, not from mistrust, not from shyness or sullen unsociability, but even quite the contrary, from something different, from some inner preoccupation, as it were strictly personal, of no concern to others, but so important for him that because of it he would, as it were, forget others. But he did love people. He lived all his life, it seemed, with complete faith in people, and yet no one ever considered him either naive or simpleton. There was something in him that told one, that convinced one, and it was all his life afterwards, that he did not want to be a judge of men, that he would not take judgment upon himself, and would not condemn anyone for anything. It seemed even that he accepted everything without the least condemnation, though often with deep sadness. Moreover, in this sense, he even went so far that no one could either surprise or frighten him, and this even in his very early youth. Coming to his father in his 20th year, precisely into that den of dirty iniquity, he chaste and pure, would simply retire quietly when it was unbearable to watch, yet without the least expression of contempt or condemnation of anyone at all. His father, a former sponger and therefore touchy and easily offended, and who met him at first with sullen suspicions. "He's too quiet," he said, "and he reasons in himself too much," soon ended up, nonetheless, in no more than 2 weeks, by hugging and kissing him terribly often, with drunken tears and tipsy sentimentality, but apparently having come to love him sincerely and deeply, more than such a man had, of course, ever imagined to love anyone else. Indeed, everyone loved this young man wherever he appeared, and it was so even in his earlier childhood, when he came to live in the house of benefactor and guardian Yefim Petrovich Polonov. He attached everyone in the family to himself, so much that they decidedly considered him as it were their own child. Yet he entered the house at such an early age that one could hardly expect in a child any calculated cunning or pushiness, or skill in gratiating himself, or knowledge of how to please and how to make himself loved. Thus he possessed in himself, in his very nature to so speak, artlessly and directly, the gift of awakening a special love for himself. It was the same with him at school, and yet it would seem that he was exactly the kind of child who awakens mistrust, sometimes mockery, and perhaps also hatred. In his schoolmates, he used, for instance, to lapse into reverie and, as it were, set himself apart. Even as a child, he liked to go into a corner and read books, and yet his schoolmates too loved him so much that he could decidedly be called everyone's favorite all the while he was at school. He was seldom playful, seldom even merry, but anyone could see at once at a glance that this was not from any kind of sullenness, that on the contrary, he was serene and even tempered. He never wanted to show off in front of his peers. Maybe for that very reason he was never afraid of anyone, and yet the boys realized at once that he was not at all proud of his fearlessness, but looked as if he did not realize that he was brave and fearless. He never remembered an offense. Sometimes an hour after the offense he would speak to the offender or answer some question with as trustful and serene an expression as though nothing had happened between them at all. And he did not look as if he had accidentally forgotten or intentionally forgiven the offense. He simply did not consider it an offense, and this decidedly captivated the boys and conquered them. There was only one trait in him that in all grades of his school, from the lowest even to the highest, awakened in his schoolmates a constant desire to tease him, not out of malicious mockery, but simply because they found it funny. This trait was a vile, frantic modesty and chastity. He could not bear to hear certain words and certain conversation about women. These certain words and conversation, unfortunately, are ineradicable in schools. Boys, while still almost children, pure in mind and heart, very often like to talk in classes among themselves and even aloud about such things, pictures and images, as even soldiers would not speak of. Moreover, many things that soldiers themselves do not know or understand are already familiar to still quite young children of our educated and higher society. There is perhaps no more depravity yet, and no cynicism either of real, depraved, inner sort, but there is external cynicism, and this is not infrequently regarded among them as something refined, subtle, daring, and worthy of emulation. Seeing that Alyosha Karamazov quickly put his fingers in his ears when they talked about that, they would sometimes purposely crowd around him, pull his hands away by force, and shout foul things into both his ear, while he struggled, slipped to the floor, lay down, covered his head, all without saying a word to them, without any abuse, silently enduring the offense. In the end, however, they left him alone and no longer teased him with being a little girl. Moreover, they looked upon him, in this respect, with compassion. Incidentally, he was always among the best of his class in his studies, but was never the first. After Yefim Petrovich died, Alyosha spent 2 more years at the local secondary school. Yefim Petrovich's inconsolable spouse left almost immediately after his death for a long visit to Italy with her whole family, which consisted entirely of persons of the female sex, while Alyosha wound up in the house of 2 ladies he had never even seen before, some distant relations of Yefim Petrovich, but on what terms he himself did not know. It was characteristic, even highly characteristic of the film, even highly characteristic of him, that he never worried about who was supporting him. In this he was the complete opposite of his old brother, Ivan Fyodorovich, who lived in poverty for his first 2 years at the university, supporting himself by his own labor, and who even as a child was bitterly aware that he was eating his benefactor's bread. But it was not possible. it seems, to judge this strange trait in Alexei's character very harshly, for anyone who got to know him a little would immediately be convinced, if the question arose, that Alexei must be one of those youths, like holy fools as it were, who, if they were to chance upon even the larger fortune, would have no trouble giving it away for a good deed to the first asker, or maybe even to some clever swindler who approached them. Generally speaking, he seemed not to know the value of money at all. Not, of course, in the literal sense. When he was given pocket money, which he himself never asked for, he either did not know what to do with it for weeks or ends, or was so terribly careless with it that it disappeared in a moment. Later, after getting used to Alyosha, Fyodor Alexandrovich Musov, who was rather ticklish on the subjects of money and bourgeois honesty, once pronounced the following aphorism: "Here perhaps is the only man in the world who, were you to leave him alone and without money on the square of some unknown city with a population of 1,000,000, would not perish, would not die of cold and hunger, for he would immediately be fed and immediately be taken care of, and if no one else took care of him, he would immediately take care of himself, and it would cost him no effort and no humiliation, and he would no burden to those who took care of him, who perhaps on the contrary would consider it a pleasure." He did not complete his studies at school. He had one more year to go when he suddenly announced to his ladies that he had to see his father about a certain matter that had come to his head. They were sorry for him and did not want to let him go. The trip was very inexpensive, and the ladies would not allow him to pawn his watch, a gift from his benefactor's family before they went abroad, but luxuriously provided him with means and even with new clothes and linen. He, however, returned half the money, announcing that he definitely intended to travel third class. On his arrival in our town, he made no direct reply to the first question of his parent: "And precisely why this visit before you have finished your studies?" But he was, they say, more than usually thoughtful. It soon became clear that he was looking for his mother's grave. He even as much as confessed himself then that that was the only sole purpose of his coming. But this hardly exhausted the reasons for his visit. Most likely, he himself did not know, and would not know at all, have been able to explain what it was precisely that suddenly rose up in his soul and irresistibly drew him into some sort of new, unknown, but already inevitable path. Fyodor Pavlovich could not show him where he had buried his second wife, because he had never visited her grave after her coffin was covered with earth, and it was all so long ago that he just could not recall where he had buried her. By the way, about Fyodor, for a long time before then, he had not been living in our town. 3 or 4 years ago, after his second wife's death, he set off for the south of Russia and finally wounded up in Odessa, where he lived for several years in a row. First, he made the acquaintance, in his own words, of a lot of youths, big youths, little youths, baby youths, but he ended up later being received not just by youths but by Jews too. We may assume it was during the period of his life that he developed his special skill at knocking money together and at knocking it out of other people. He came back to our town again, finally only 3 years before Alyosha's arrival. Former acquaintances found him terribly aged. Though he was by no means such an old man, he behaved, shall we say, not with more dignity, but somehow with more effrontery. There appeared in his old buffoon, for example, an insolent need to make others into buffoons. He now loved to be outrageous with the female sex, not simply as before, but even somehow in a more repulsive way. He soon became the founder of a number of new taverns throughout the district. It was apparent that he had maybe as much as 100,000, or perhaps only a little less. Many inhabitants of our town and district immediately got into debt with him, naturally on the best securities. Lately he had somehow become bloated. He began somehow to be erratic, lost his self-control, and even fell into a sort of lightheadedness. He would start one thing and end up with another. He somehow became scattered, and he got drunk more and more often. If it hadn't been for the very same servant Gregory, who by then had also aged considerably and who looked after him sometimes almost like a tutor, Fyodor would not have gotten away without serious trouble. Alyosha's arrival seemed to affect him even on the moral side, as if something woke up in this ultimately old man, something that had long been stifled in the soul. "Do you know," he now often said to Alyosha, studying him intently, "you resemble her, the shrieker." That was how he referred to his dead wife, Alyosha's mother. The shrieker's grave was finally pointed out to Alyosha by the servant Grigory. He took him to our town cemetery, and there in a remote corner showed him a cast iron marker, inexpensive but well tended, on which there was an inscription giving the name, social position, age, and date of death of the deceased woman, and below that even some sort of four-line verse chosen from the old cemetery lore commonly used on middle-class tombs. Surprisingly, this marker turned out to be Grigory's doing. He himself had erected it over the grave of poor Shrieker at his own expense. After Fyodor, whom he had already pestered with numberless reminders about the grave, finally went off to Odessa, brushing aside not only graves but all his memories. Alyosha did not show any particular emotion at his mother's grave. He simply listened to a solemn and sensible account of construction of the marker, stood for a while looking downcast, and walked away without saying a word. After that, perhaps even for a whole year, he did not visit the cemetery. But this little episode also had an effect on Fyodor Pavlovich, and a very original one. He suddenly took 1,000 rubles and brought them to our monastery to have memorial services set for the soul of his wife, but not for his second wife, Alyosha's mother, the shrieker, but of the first, Adelaida Ivanova, who used to thrash him. In the evening of the day he got drunk and berated monks to Alyosha. He was far from religious. The man probably had never put a 5-kopeck candle in front of an icon. Strange fits of sudden feelings and sudden thoughts come over such individuals. I have already mentioned that he had grown very bloated. His physiognomy by that time presented something that testified acutely to the characteristics and essence of his whole life. Besides the long fleshy bags under his eternally insolent, suspicious, and leering little eyes, besides the multitude of deep wrinkles on his fat little face, a big Adam's apple, fleshy and oblong like a purse, hung below his sharp chin, giving him a sort of repulsively sensual appearance. Add to that a long, carnivorous mouth with plump lips, behind which could be seen the little stumps of black, almost decayed teeth. He sprayed saliva whenever he spoke. However, he himself liked to make jokes about his own face, although he was apparently pleased with it. He pointed specially to his nose, which was not very big but was very thin and noticeably hooked. A real Roman one, he used to say. Along with my Adam's apple, it gives me the real physiognomy of an ancient Roman patrician of decadent period. He seemed to be proud of it. And then quite soon after finding his mother's grave, Alyosha suddenly announced to him that he wanted to enter the monastery and that the monks were prepared to accept him as a novice. He explained further that this was the highest desire, that he was asking for his solemn consent as his father. The old man already knew that the elder Josima, who was seeking salvation in the monastery hermitage, had made a particular impression on his quiet boy. That elder is, of course, the most honest man there, he remarked, having listened to Alyosha silently and thoughtfully, almost, however, as if he were not at all surprised by his request. So that's where you want to go, my quiet boy." He was half drunk, and certainly smiled his long half-drunken smile, which was not devoid of cunning and drunken shyness. I even had a feeling you would end up with something like that. Can you imagine? That's just where you were headed. Well, why not? After all, do have a little 2,000. There's a dowry for you, and I, my angel, will never forget you. I'll pay in for you now, to wherever there's due. If they ask and if they don't ask, well, we can't go pushing ourselves on them, can we? You spend money like canary anyway, 2 little grains a week. You know, there is one monastery that has a little village nearby, and everybody around knows that only monastery wives live there. That's what they call them, about 30 little bits of wives. I'd say I was there, and you know, it's interesting in its own way, of course, for the sake of variety. The only trouble is this terrible Russianism. There are no French women at all, not so far, and there could be. The money's there, plenty of it. Once the word gets around, they'll come. Well, there's nothing like that there. No monastery wives and about 200 monks. It's honest. They fast, I admit it. So you want to go to the monks? You know, I'm sorry for you, Alyosha. Truly, believe me, I've grown to love you. However, it's a good opportunity. You can pray for us sinners. We have sat around sinning too much. I keep thinking all the time, who is ever going to pray for me? Is there anyone in the world? My dear boy, you know, I'm terribly stupid about these things. Would you believe it? Terribly stupid. You see, stupid as I am, I still keep thinking about it. I keep thinking every once in a while, of course, not all the time. Surely it's impossible. I think that the devils will forget to drag me down to their place with their hooks when I die. And then I think, hooks? Where do they get them? What are they made of? Iron? Where do they forge them? Have they got some kind of factory down there? You know, in the monastery, the monks probably believe there is a ceiling in hell, for instance. Now me, I'm ready to believe in hell. Only there shouldn't be any ceiling. That would be as it were more refined, more enlightened, more Lutheran. In other words, does it really make any difference with a ceiling or without a ceiling? But that's what the damn question is all about. Because if there is no ceiling, then there are no hooks. And if there are no hooks, the whole things fall apart. Which again is unlikely, because then who will drag me down with hooks? Because if they don't drag me down, what then? And where is there any justice in the world? Those hooks, just for me alone. Because you have no idea, Alyosha, what a stinker I am. No, there are no hooks there. Alyosha sat quietly and seriously, studying his father. Yes, only shadows of hooks. I know. That's how one Frenchman described hell. How do you know, my dear, that there are no hooks? When you have been with the monks for a while, you'll sing a different tune. But go, get to the truth there, and come back, and tell me. Anyway, it will be easier to go to the other world knowing for certain what it's like, and it will be more proper for you to live with the monks than with me, a little old drunk man with his young girls. Though you are like an angel, nothing touches you. Well, maybe nothing will touch you there either. That's why I'm letting you do it, because I hope for that. The devil hasn't made off with your wits. You'll burn and burn out. You'll get cured and come back, and I'll be waiting for you. I really feel you are the only one in the world who hasn't condemned me. You are, my dear boy. I feel it. How can I not feel it? He even began to snivel. He was sentimental. He was wicked and sentimental.